Before Mr. Ross and myself set off for the Headless Valley, we obtained the Headless Valley newspaper file of clippings from the Calgary Public Library, and to say the least, they were most confusing. There were hair-raising stories about the number of persons who had been found murdered with their heads missing. Then the very next clipping might claim that the Headless Valley didn't exist at all. News item after news item told of victims who had never returned from that land of mystery. Most reporters didn't actually know where the Headless Valley was located, but they all agreed that it was a place that people entered, then disappeared for various most mysterious reasons. Actually, there are now about 30-some persons who are known to have lost their lives in the valley. Most of the deaths can be accounted for by murders, attacks by grizzly bears, drownings, or starvation, without having to blame some mysterious disease, as some of the reporters have done. Most newspaper articles claim that the Headless Valley is in northern British Columbia, but actually it is in the valley of the South Nahanni River, well up in Canada's Northwest Territories, within about 300 miles of the Arctic Circle. About 1,100 miles north of the U.S. border along the Alaska Highway is Old Fort Nelson, the usual jumping-off point by canoe for the Headless Valley. From the old fort there on the Fort Nelson River, one goes down to where it joins the Liard River, then on down the Liard to the mouth of the South Nahanni River. And finally, to get up into the actual Headless Valley, one has to fight up through the canyons and rapids of the South Nahanni River. From the white red roof buildings of the Hudson Bay Company, the town of Old Fort Nelson is strung out for a couple of miles downstream. Among the native houses, there's a free trading post, then the school and other church establishments. And away down at the other end of town, there's another free trader. If one post doesn't have what they want, the natives just jump into their canoes and go up or down the river to the next one. No one seems to do much walking. This town of Old Fort Nelson is across the river from the highway with no access except by boat. And just in case you don't have your own canoe along, there is a water taxi here that you can hire for 25 cents per person per trip. Old Fort Nelson is a jumping-off point for the far north by plane as well as by boat. Every short while all day there are planes landing or taking off for places like Fort Resolution, Fort Simpson, Fort Wrigley, Harry River, or Clavic, or they may have crews of geologists or surveyors taking off for all the unmapped corners of the north. We camped directly across the river from the old fort in a solid bed of roses. The natives had told us that this was a good place to camp this early in the season, but later in the summer there would be too many bears around eating the rose hips. Well, we weren't bothered by any bears, but the natives were holding a gambling party up directly across the river, so between tom-toms pounding, natives chanting, and outboard motors roaring, several hundred dogs howling, it certainly wasn't a night of rest for us. It was a relief to load up our camp equipment the next morning and get away from all those howling dogs. We had a 3-month scrub steak along and 22 gallons of gasoline, so in spite of keeping camp equipment down to the absolute minimum, we had a canoe load of about 800 pounds. Every day Ethel kept tossing out a trolling lure to try and catch us a fish for dinner, but she found absolutely no fish. And it wasn't until about 300 miles downriver that we learned that the fish in these rivers just won't bite on a moving lure. We passed a few trappers' cabins, but at that time of year everything was closed up and deserted. Then about 20 miles below Fort Nelson we came to the native settlement of Snake River, which was also all boarded up. There was no one there except a few million mosquitoes, and every one of them came out to meet us. At that time of year all the rivers were practically deserted. We tried our best to find mud or sandbars to camp on, partly because the insects were as bad out in the open, partly because it wasn't as far to pack all our supplies. Now, the river was rising fast, and sometimes it would be up almost lapping our doorstep by morning. It was almost at full flood, and we were almost covered with frost. We were making great time. A couple of days' run brought us to what the natives call the rock which stands in the water, and we knew that we weren't far from where the Fort Nelson would join the Liard. The Nelson was in full flood now, Whole trees were tearing loose from the banks, and the river was so winding that we weren't sure just where we were until our boat spewed out onto the wide Liard, which was flooding even higher than the Nelson had been. This Liard is thick with islands and channels, and all those logs were piling up into jams at the head of the islands. One has to be pretty careful not to let the current carry him down into the wrong channel, or he may end up in one of the log jams with a smashed canoe. And in the north, there isn't much chance of getting out if you ever lose that canoe. Like everyone else, the Hudson Bay Company post called Francois was all boarded up, and the natives' houses were empty. In the winter, that post to Francois would be opened up in charge of a young apprentice to trade with the few native trappers. But no matter how deserted the country is, there is no excuse for being lonely. There are millions and millions of mosquitoes doing their best to get acquainted with you. They have a welcome committee out to meet you as soon as you get within about 20 feet of shore. They were all just one great big friendly family. In fact, when we did get ashore there, we found that they all seemed to want to become blood brothers. Out on the water, there was always enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes away and to keep one cool in spite of a midsummer temperature of around 100 degrees. But the moment you go ashore, you just have to get a smudge going until you can slap up a tent and get in behind the mosquito netting. Some 210 miles below Fort Nelson, we pulled into Fort Liard about 10 o'clock in the morning of the 1st of July, which happened to be a Sunday. Well, like most of the northern posts, Fort Liard had 3 representatives of civilization. There was the Hudson Bay Post, the RCMP constable, the French missionary, and represented, they might say, trio of law, God, and mammon. Well, this was Sunday, and we were almost decided that we were alone on the rivers with the mosquitoes when the Hudson Bay Company manager and the RCMP constable came down to the shore. They told us that the natives were holding a dance that night, so we unloaded our canoe onto the police barge and prepared to stay over a day. The RCMP keep a launch and a barge there at Fort Liard for river patrols and a couple of dog teams for winter patrols. The dog teams are tied up in the back of the police compound where we camp, and Willie McLeod, a special constable, is feeding the 2 teams. Now, it was Willie's 2 uncles who disappeared into that Nahanni country in 1905 and were supposed to have been found without their heads to start the Headless Valley legend. Willie's oldest daughter was looking after the family while his wife was away. My wife Ethel was looking after the youngest McLeod, or probably vice versa. Willie told us about his uncles being found in the Headless Valley. He said everyone else was there, including the cat. Then just about sundown, a wild chant started and the native dances got underway. From now on, if anyone asks me where the rumba or the samba originated, I think I'll be able to tell them. There were no drums or music of any kind, just a series of chants that got higher and higher, wilder and wilder as the night wore on. I had a slight suspicion that there was a jug of something back in the cabins. A big black cloud came over the sun finally, but the dances kept right on until the smallest hour of the morning. They just went around and around and around. In the morning, we headed away from Old Fort Liard into another stretch of empty rivers between there and the trading post of South Nahanni at the mouth of the South Nahanni River. What impressed us most in the north was that feeling of immense emptiness. We ran early and late, and with Ethel in the front of a 17-foot canoe, and me in the back with an outboard motor roaring in her ears. About the only way we could talk was by sign language. Sometimes we could understand each other, sometimes we couldn't. So if any of you gentlemen's wives have a tendency toward backseat driving, I can highly recommend a canoe trip. You can always do your own backseat driving. Well, finally, out of the swamplands along the yard, the odd-shaped Nahanni Butte looms up and begins to get closer and closer. You know that you're nearing the mouth of the South Nahanni River, the gateway to Headless Valley. That trading post of South Nahanni isn't a Hudson Bay Company. post. It's a free trading post run by Mr. and Mrs. Turner and their family. And here at the mouth of the Nahanni, the mountains come close to the flat country of the Liard. As the Liard rolls across through channels from right to left there, the South Nahanni enters from the lower right with the trading post there on the nearer bank. Down at the trading post, the Turner children's saddle mare Lady let us in on her secret about a handle of mosquitoes. Lady stood in the smoke of a smudge built in an old tub, and about every hour she would paw on that tub until someone built another fire and gave her some more smoke. Then between her sessions at the smoke tub, Lady, along with the two Turner children, Ralph and Martha, usually managed to move around fast enough to keep ahead of at least some of the mosquitoes. Ordinarily, there are only 9 native hunters like these and their families who trade there at that South Nahanni post. The natives of this part of the north are fast disappearing. But that summer, the Dominion government and the Texaco Oil Company each had a crew of geologists in the area. They were being flown into the surrounding mountains and then brought back for lunch and night camp, so it all added up to an almost continual whip of helicopter blades overhead. There has been quite a bit of oil drilling activity in the country south of the Liard River, with wells being drilled and capped until there are sufficient number to warrant a pipeline. Now these crews were being flown out into the mountain north of the river, where they could go down into the canyons and check the depths of the formation. To add to all that activity, the Texaco Company had Charlie Jensen's riverboat from Fort Nelson servicing their crew of geologists. They were hauling in supplies and gasoline for the helicopters and also acting as a floating cookhouse. All the table scraps were thrown off into the water to keep from attracting any bears, but they ended up attracting all the fish for miles around. The fishing was so good that these boys just couldn't even find time to shave, not even the cook. This is where Ethel learned that she'd been wasting her time for 300 miles with a trolling hook. Most of these fish were trout or Arctic grayling, and what they preferred was a quiet hook baited with some kind of meat, preferably a fresh red meat. Charlie Jensen's part native son was a champion little fisherman when he wasn't too interested in the camera, but usually whenever that camera would start to run, he'd forget all about his fishing. We found the Arctic grayling about the best flavored fish that we had ever tasted. The local people called them bluefish, and you could always recognize them by the high back fin and the shimmering blue color when they were first caught. Amidst all that boat and helicopter traffic, there arrived by canoe one of the really grand old men of the north. Albert Paley, in the back of the canoe there, had at that time spent more than 30 years trapping and prospecting along the South Nahanni River, and he undoubtedly knew more about the canyons and rapids of the Headless Valley than any other person. Before he left on another prospecting trip to the upper river, he gave us some tips on how to hit the rapids, and it was information that we certainly appreciated later on. Now he will drop the Nahanni game warden and the warden's son off at their home across the river and set off into the canyons alone. Oh, before we also started up the Nahanni, we climbed to the top of the Nahanni Butte to take a look at the country we were going into. The butte is on about 4,000 feet in elevation, and with the river considerably lower than 1,000 feet, it gives one quite a view of the entire South Nahanni River Valley. So we climbed to the point of the butte, looked out across the winding S-curves of the first 8 miles of river, which were quiet water, then on up across the miles of the splits and into the midst of the Nahanni where we intended going. The splits of the Nahanni are a roaring mass of water split off by islands into channels and side channels without number, and all with a terrific fall. Being a glacial river, the South Nahanni carries down tremendous loads of rock. These pile up in a channel until the river shifts and cuts itself out a new channel. Well, the river was rising and all these channels were roaring like mad. We were using a 7.5 horsepower motor on a little canoe which had been recommended only for a 3 horsepower motor, but sometimes that current would carry us back even at full power until we could find a spot with a little less current. They had told us in South Nahanni that a boat with less than a 10 horsepower motor had never managed to get up the Nahanni. We had refilled our containers with 22 gallons of gasoline there at the trading post, but it was running through at a terrific rate, and there were 165 miles left between us and the falls, which we had been told would get worse and worse the farther we went. It began to look as if we wouldn't even manage to get into Dead Man Valley unless we could conserve on our gasoline some way. So we began looking around for tracking beaches. Now, there aren't many beaches along the Nahanni where you can track your canoe. Most places there are too many log jams jutting out, or the brush is too thick to push through. But if you do find a place where you can track your canoe, one can sometimes make better time than he could with a motor against that current. A couple of times we made a mistake in all that mass of islands and got into a side channel. Whenever that happened, we would have some easy going for a ways, and where we could trot right along. But then there was always a fight to get out through a log jam at the head of the island, back out into the main kernel again. The current at the head of these islands was always terrific. It was too shallow and full of logs to use your motor, so one just has to manhandle his canoe through the best way he can. The farther we went up into the valley, the more it began to look as if Headless Valley had been wrongly named. It wasn't at all headless. Everywhere you looked, there were another missing head. The Nahanni is a place of sudden changes. A cloud no bigger than a hand will form over some mountain. In a half hour, it will spread over the entire sky, and then another half hour it will be gone again. We weren't quite at the Arctic Circle, so we missed seeing the midnight sun. This happened to be just 25 minutes to midnight. Well, deciding to stay over a day in the hopes that the river might go down, I followed a trail out into the brush and came to an old deserted cache that some trapper had left. And then on the way back to camp, I saw where some curious cat had been looking over my tracks. As there are no cougar in the Nahanni country, it must have been just lynx. But from the size of the tracks, I thought that cat would make a pretty good movie shot. So I looked all around through the brush, but to tell you the truth, I didn't look too hard. The more I thought about the size of the tracks, the more my hair started to stand on end, and I decided it would be a pretty good time to go back to camp, and while my hair was still standing on end, it might be just as well to get a haircut. Now, after a few days of camping on those sand dars, everything gets filled with sand. Once that happens, the sand just seeps into everything. The clippers got dull, the scissors got dull, and my razor got dull, and I began to envy those geologists with the long beards. In a couple of days, the river had dropped about a foot, so we started on up through the splits, and every foot of it was a fight. The current was so swift that we would sometimes have to line up 2 trees on shore to see if we were moving at all. Most boats which get up the Nahanni manage it by clamping on 2 10-horsepower motors. From South Nahanni to the falls, you were climbing a hill of water almost 1,000 feet high. Finally, we got far enough up the valley that we began to see the Tlogacho, or the Goat Curry Mountains, through which the Nahanni roars in a series of canyons. We began to see where all that water was coming from. High up on the mountains, the glacial snow was still melting, and we could hear rocks rolling and growling along the bottom of the river. One of those glaciers away up there in Canada's Northwest Territories was being very unpatriotic. It was doing its best to mimic the American eagle. Then, coming closer to the Tlogacho Mountains, we passed into a more alpine country. Black bears were out working on the berry patches along the slopes. From here on, if we left camp for any length of time, we had to be very careful to cache our supplies out of reach of those bears. Up in this higher country, there are very few mosquitoes, black flies over, no-see-ums. You can walk the hills without being driven wild by the insects. Most of these slopes had been burnt over by forest fires at some time or another, and in contrast to the dead, empty forests along the yard, the hills were carpeted with flowers, bright with butterflies and moths going out on the business and rivaling the flowers themselves. Many times in those hundreds of miles we had traveled through the lifeless forests along the Liard River, we had been tempted to turn back, but this was another world entirely. It was living and beautiful. And then just below the mouth of the first canyon are the hot springs, which have for years been the basis of stories about a tropical valley there in the distant north. As you walk back from the river to the springs, the vegetation is of such a semi-tropical nature that a person could almost believe those native tales of prehistoric monsters which are supposed to have survived down through the ages in a tropical valley which winter never touches. Even today the natives say that the Nahanni is taboo, and they refuse to enter the canyons. Among the springs, the air was alive with butterflies and bees going about their business, gathering supplies, and the ground is packed with game trails. We saw tracks of moose and caribou, wolves and bear. The springs themselves came out along the cliffs of the mountain ring valley, and we could see, we could smell a strong sulfur content. The rotten egg odor of sulfur is strong throughout the valley. Springs bubble above every place and join together to form fair-sized creeks. Gus Kraus, the Nahanni game warden, once had a garden among these springs, and he claimed that his potatoes didn't freeze all winter. The valley of the hot springs is protected by cliffs on nearly all sides, which helps hold its semi-tropical climate. We found Gus's old cabin back among the trees. It was in good shape in spite of not having been used for several years. A sign on the inside of the door offers you the use of it, provided that you close the door and put up the shutters and a few other dozen things before you leave. The old cabins are all pretty musty, so we preferred camping in our tent. But I had always wondered what would be in an old deserted cache, and here was really made chance to find out. It was comforting to know that if we did get caught up there in the freeze-up, at least 1.5 persons could get out on snowshoes. Well, since the river was still dropping, we spent several days around the hot springs. In the mornings, the mysterious mists of the Nahanni would come drifting down out of the first canyon, make us wonder what awaited us up in there. While we were at the springs, Ethel did a washing, and she found she could wash in hot water and then just move across and rinse in cold. And whenever she finds a tropical valley equipped with both hot and cold running water, Ethel just can't resist trying them all. Those springs didn't get a moment's rest as long as Ethel was there. Finally, she dug a package of yeast buns out of one of the pack sacks and set some yeast buns to rise on that overworked spring. After just a few minutes over that hot water, boy did they rise. With a few red coals raked under them and under the pan and a good fire reflecting down on them, you can have hot biscuits faster than any oven will do them. And after weeks of eating a baking powder mix, I was willing to say, after I tried one and gave it my careful consideration, that those are the kind my mother used to try to make. Well, nobody likes a compliment on a cooking better than Ethel does. When a bunch of bees quit gathering nectar and came around to eat biscuit crumbs, that was the compliment and all compliments. I had to move back and take a back seat. In fact, so many bees came around that we finally moved camp entirely. Above the hot springs, the Nahanni roars through the first, second, and third canyons, which are what makes it such a dangerous piece of water. As we watch the famous mists of the Nahanni come drifting down out of the first of the canyons, we could well understand how superstitious natives had built it up into a place of mystery. Wherever we would look up at the canyon walls, you see one of the so-called Mongol caves dominating every reach of river. Everyone looked as if fallen rock had just been dumped from the entrances. Some were high up on the cliffs and looked as if they would be almost impossible to get to. Some of them were down just among the treetops. With the black mouths of all those caverns staring at us, sometimes we would get a feeling that someone was watching us. And usually whenever we got that feeling, we would look around and we would find someone peering at us. Nothing was going to get past these lookouts. They just stared you straight in the eye. Before entering into the rapids of the canyons, we took a slight precaution by inflating our rubber mattresses and tying them down into the top of the load. If our canoe swamped, we thought that the rubber mattresses would probably float us out. Your only chance of survival in these canyons is to stay with your canoe and load, so we tied the load down thoroughly and we determined to stay with that canoe at any cost. Now, the walls of the first canyon go up sheer for thousands of feet, and there are few places with any beaches at the foot of the cliffs. One former explorer, the Nanny, had claimed that these canyons are deeper than the Grand Canyon. While this has proved to be not quite correct, they are still very sizable canyons, especially when one considers their sheer drop and their very narrow width at the top. Quantities of tremendous boulders have fallen off the canyon walls, and many of them were sticking up just below the surface where we couldn't see them. The Simpson Sears Company had helped us select their solidest canoe in their stock, and we began to appreciate that steel-alloyed aluminum canoe as we bounced off those boulders. Ethel was testing bottom all the way now and kept motioning me over into deeper water. And if that deep water was too rough to get into, sometimes we would hit bottom with the propeller and break a shear pin. Well, the first time that happened, the current carried us way downstream. But after that, whenever possible, we would jump in and drag when a pin broke and try to conserve on the gasoline. We broke a shear pin on Lafferty's Ripple and had to jump into the glacial water and get up through the ripple and around the next bend of the canyon. Whenever we would turn another corner of the canyon, there would be more of those Mongol caves looking down at us. The natives used to tell stories about huge hairy men with red eyes who were supposed to inhabit these canyons and carry off any lone hunters or the squaws they happened to see. It was an odd sensation to be way up there alone with all the mouths of all those caverns hanging overhead. It gives you a feeling that someone just might be watching you. So we made camp on a little beach and decided to go see just what was in all those caverns. To save weight, I had brought along just a pickhead to use for climbing and getting out some rock specimens. And as soon as I made a quick handle for it, we were ready to go. There are dozens and dozens of these so-called Mongol caves. Some are in the main canyon, but many of them are way back inside canyons. I spent quite a few days poking around back among those canyons. Most of the caves were way up on ledges and pretty hard to get to. We had to be extremely careful because any injury like a broken leg away up there in that country wouldn't leave one much of a chance of getting out. Some of the caverns were only 20 or 30 feet deep, and one could see clear to the back by daylight. In others, we had to use a light to get back to the end. And then there were some that were so deep that we didn't ever manage to reach the end of the cage. These caverns aren't at all safe. They're in a very shattered formation, and the floors are all covered with large blocks of rock, which have fallen off the roofs very recently. The continual fall of rock gives the caves that appearance of just having had a load of rock dumped out by some Mongol tenant enlarging his premises. At least we hoped it was just the rock fall that made them look that way. Well, way back in one cavern, we found a blackened spot on the floor, which looked like the embers of an old fire. And what what appeared to be some sort of drawings on the wall. So after brushing away the dust from the drawings we got wood and built up a fire to try and get enough light to photograph by. But even with the firelight supplementing my lamp, I had to take these shots of the drawings at single frame time exposures. We began to think that perhaps the natives had some basis of those tales they used to tell about the big hairy men with the red eyes. The cave entrances all had piles of tremendous boulders. The bottom rocks of these piles would be all mossy and covered with dirt and dust. And then the top ones were always freshly broken and chipped. Some of them with even a layer of dust on them. Some of the caves were so low that you had to crawl in on your hands and knees, but others had rooms that would almost hold a two-story building. Another of the caverns we explored had a high vaulted entrance which led into a long wide passage going straight back into the mountain. And way back at the end of that passage we found a opening through which we could just manage to crawl into a regular maze of passages at a higher level. We had 300 feet of nylon rope with us. We tied one end there at the opening and went back into the various corridors and rooms. In one of those rooms we found another blackened spot on the floor and some more of those odd sketches. We paid our 300 feet of nylon rope in several directions, but it never did get us to the end of the passages. We felt we would be foolish to try to go in any deeper without better equipment, and believe me, it felt good to be back out into the fresh air and sunlight again. As we went on up through the first canyon, we found that it wasn't all rapids by any means. Above every reach of water there would be a stretch of calmer water where you could get your breath in before you had to hit the next rapid. We were finding a lovely unspoiled vacation land. Back when furs used to be more valuable, there had been trappers along the Nahanni, huge over-trap lines, and some of the trappers murdered for their furs. Now the very few people ever indeed go into these canyons. We came to a place where a crystal clear stream burst right out of the mountainside and formed probably one of the shortest rivers in North America. It ran only a few yards before it joined the Nahanni. Now I had been told that just below these clear streams the fishing would be terrific. So I got out my fishing equipment and set out to show Ethel just how to catch fish for dinner. Well, the first couple of casts I made, no luck at all. So I tied on a larger hook and I began to get results immediately. As you can see, there's lots of fish though left up there in those stream. Every time we left camp for any length of time, there was a job of caching our pack sacks which held our 2 months' food supplies. The sandbars were covered with bear tracks and we didn't see many of them, but we often heard one grunting or scrambling through the brush. And up in that country, we didn't dare take any chance of losing our having our camp raided and losing our supplies. Your first mistake can be your last in these canyons. Only the year before, a young fellow had to walk partway in, expecting to live off the country. But his food ran out, and he made a raft and tried to get out, but his raft broke up in rapids, and his body was found a couple of months later way down on the Liard River. Often we would climb way up on some ridge and use a 40-power telescope to look at the surrounding country where we were going into and watch the game going about their everyday lives. Ethel seemed to be just having a little bit of trouble holding that telescope steady. I don't know why that was. I certainly had no trouble like that. Way over across the valley we saw some sheep in a little swale, and then down below them in some thick trees we spotted a bunch of white specks, which turned out to be several goats scrambling around on a mineral lick. There must have been something quite attractive in that hillside, because it looked as if generations of those goats had it almost eaten away. This time of year, most of the game spent the heat of the day lying hidden in the thickest of brush. One very seldom got a chance to see them, although we often heard moose or bear scrambling through the brush. Later in the fall, when the leaves had dropped, the game would be a lot more visible up there. The first canyon was about 15 miles long, and as we fought up through the rapids and got closer to Dead Man's Valley, we began to see some of the missing heads. Some of them were quite everyday sort of heads, but there were others that I would have sworn were Mongols. I had a desire to climb up and trim the whiskers on this guy's nose, but I didn't have the time, and I didn't like his looks anyway. So if he's still there waiting if anyone else would like that job. With all those heads hanging over our heads, and one of the famous Miss Winds of the Nahanni whistling and moaning through the crags above, we could easily understand how the natives had developed their taboos about these canyons. When one of those winds funnels down through the canyon, there is the howling and laughing and shrieking like a million devils. Every crack and crevice of the canyon wall gives out some sort of a weird sound. The whole Nahanni Valley has become known as Headless Valley, but the actual Dead Man's Valley lies between the first and second canyons, and at its lower end, most effectively locking it away from the outside world, is that rapid known as George's Riffle. Before you enter Dead Man, as they familiarly call the valley in the north, you have to find a key which will unlock George's Riffle. We had been told in South Nahanni that even if we got through the splits and the first canyon, we could never get through George's Riffle in a canoe. In fact, we had heard so much about George's Riffle that we'd made our own private joke. It was something about letting George take care of himself. We were going to the falls. But believe me, your jokes about George can fall pretty flat when you stand there on shore and listen to his deep-throated roar and watch the 3-foot waves churning from cliff to cliff. We didn't like the looks of George, we didn't like the sound of George. In fact, we didn't like anything at all about George, so we decided to go around him. Our canoe was getting pounded against the rocks so badly in the waves that I got in a hurry there and almost got a dunking. The only place for portage was over a bunch of huge boulders. We decided it was too late in the evening to make that portage, so we looked around for a place to camp. And finally, by moving about a half-ton of rocks, we cleared a space almost big enough for the tent. But before morning, we found that even air mattresses weren't too good for that kind of a campsite. In the morning, the famous Miss of the Nahanni came sifting along the cliffs, and we wondered what lay beyond George. All night we had kept waking up and thinking we heard voices shouting and chanting, but it was only old George talking in his sleep, I hope. This is going to be easy, just a few 100 yards of nice smooth going. Of course, there's the odd little rock to step over, and we didn't pay any attention to them. We would have liked to have portaged a bit farther above George, but because of the cliffs ahead, we had to drop the canoe in just above the worst of the rapid. And then after we move our load of supplies and equipment, all we'll have to do is get the motor roaring and shoot across the other side to the island. If we don't break a shear pin and go down through George backwards, this is going to be almost too easy. Now all we have to do is go back and hang 2 pack sacks apiece on our pack sergeants. There are only 10 of those sacks, so it's going to just amount to about 2.5 trips for each of us. At least that's what I thought. But you know, the most peculiar thing happened? Ethel's packboard broke completely in two the very first trip. My packboard was good and solid, so I'll give you 3 guesses as to how those 10 pack sacks got up to the canoe. Finally, with a good packboard, there's nothing to this portaging, just a few more trips. Besides 10 pack sacks, there's just the motor and 9 gas and oil cans. Of course, there's the tarpaulin and a couple of slickers and cameras and tripod and a few small things like a camp stove, axe and paddle. And then there's a couple of bailing cans and fish lines and tow ropes. There's a couple of boards we use to keep the load up off the bottom of the boat. And there's a depth testing pole. I wonder if that's everything. No, I'm going to have to go back there. I've almost forgot the tent. Now through that gap lies Deadman's Valley. But we still have to get across to the island and look over 2 bad riffles at the upper end of the island. We made it across without being carried down into George. In fact, we had a good 10 feet to spare. But we could see that the 2 upper riffles had too many rocks and they were too shallow to get through with the motor. So I decided the easiest solution was just to get out and drag. Just above George's riffle, Albert Faley passed us on his way down. He had found the river too high to get through up near the falls. So now, as far as we knew, there were no humans besides ourselves between South Nanny and the Arctic Ocean in that direction. And the reason I'm out there dragging instead of using a tracking rope is because we had a very nerve-shattering experience just below the airways when a tracking rope broke and we almost lost the canoe and supplies. So after that, I kept my hands on that canoe at all times. We found the aluminum canoe a great thing for the rapids with its smooth sides, and it handled easily, and being metal, it just bounced over into everything. Finally, we had beaten Old George. The gate to the Deadman's Valley stood unlocked. We climbed to the top of a little pointed butte and looked out across the Mountain Ring Valley where the 2 McLeod brothers' bodies were found in 1908. Their camp was in thick timber over across the valley, near where the Nahanni roars down out of the second canyon. For us, this peaceful-looking valley was a milestone. It's the halfway mark between South Nahanni and the Falls. As we turned and looked back, we could only faintly hear George's River roaring at the mouth of the canyon behind that island. George's River would have to be tackled again to get back to civilization, but for now we forgot all about him. Next morning the mist hung all along the valley. Our camp was on a little sandbar island, so we took a chance on no bears finding our campsite and left our dinner cooking while we crossed to Patterson Point, where R.M. Patterson, the author of the book Dangerous River, had spent the winter of 1927, 30 years ago. There on the point where Patterson and a partner had wintered on his second trip into the valley, we found just the crumbling remains of a cache and a tumble-down cabin. But down the river ways are remains of what had been a native trapping settlement. This was a settlement which once received the newspaper headlines when the chief of a U.S. Geological Survey had claimed that there was an Indian village was once wiped out here by a very bad epidemic of meningitis. Now, he claimed that any time trappers or prospectors camped close by, their campfires aroused that latent bacteria. A doctor from Fort St. John, B.C. is supposed to have found the bones of 7 white men close by, and tests from the bones were supposed to have proved that latent bacteria. Well, we had left our campfire over across the other side of the river, so we didn't either prove or disapprove that story. Here in Deadman's Valley, the trees are thick and dark, with only the odd shaft of sun reaching the ground. Often we would think that we heard a noise beside the trail, and for a moment its cold chill would run up our spines. Usually a spruce grouse, that so-called fool hen, would stalk out very unconcernedly, or perhaps we might be walking along with our feet making no noise in the pine needles, when a scrambling and grunting beside the trail would nearly scare us out of our skins. Usually it was something about like this, but when the old lady came along to see what was going on, we would find most urgent business elsewhere. Here at the upper end of the valley, just below the opening where the Nahanni boils down out of the second canyon, are the woods where the McLeod brothers were supposed to have been murdered by their partner in 1905 to give the valley its name and most of its sinister reputation. Beside a peaceful little creek, which they now call Murder Creek, are the dark and tangled woods where the McLeods were found, supposedly with their heads missing. One in a night bed, and the other one half out of bed, as if he had been reaching for his rifle a few feet away. So run the newspaper stories. But to add to that mystery, Willie McLeod at Fort Liard had told us that his uncles were buried with their heads and that they had no partner. The trees were eerie enough that we could believe almost anything. Several streams had entered the Nahanni at Dead Men Valley, with the result that the river was a bit shallower, has a lot worse rapids in the second canyon. Ethel was testing bottom steadily now, and we were hitting bottom, breaking one sheer pin right after another. Much of this water was too swift to jump into, so whenever a pin broke, it was just grab your paddle and head for shore. We had been foolish enough to start out without a spare propeller, and that continual hitting rocks finally broke out the inside shoulders that hold the sheer pin. It looked like the end of the road unless I could do some kind of a fast job. That didn't look too promising. I only had a very minimum of tools along, but I did manage to find a very poor substitute for a power drill, and after a lot of this and a lot of that, and I finally did manage to get 4 holes through the propeller hub. Now, if everything works the way that it's supposed to, those wires are supposed to hold a couple of solder shoulders, which in turn are supposed to hold the shear pins. Under very strong protest, I melted some solder in Ethel's best tramp frying pan. Now, if we don't get lead poisoning from the pan and become another one of those missing mists from the Nahanni, perhaps we'll manage to get ourselves to the falls. While I had been working on the propeller, Ethel had been scouting around, and she had sighted this tremendous strip of strawberries. We had never seen a patch of wild strawberries like these anyplace. While they weren't quite as large as tame berries, they made up for in sweetness. In no time at all, we had a whole pan of them picked, and Ethel insisted he was going to camp right there to bake a strawberry shortcake. Well, after a month on dry rations like rice and raisins and oatmeal and beans, I can assure you that she didn't have to insist very hard. There was no problem in keeping the berries cool while she baked the cake. They just went into the fridge there, which was thermostatically controlled at a few degrees above freezing. And then for the shortening, it's just a matter of the right amount of red coals under the pan so that it will bake evenly bottom and top. And if any of you ladies ever go up into the Headless Valley and need a recipe for shortcake mix, it's really quite simple. Ethel just used some of our regular camp biscuit mix. And the recipe for that was 50 pounds of flour, 4 pounds of baking powder, 4 pounds of dried milk, 4 pounds of sugar, and 4 pounds of shortening, 2 pounds of salt. Just a little more shortening and a little more sugar, and presto, you have shortcake mix. Your campfire will do the job of baking in only half the time an oven will, so you can get yourselves all set for strawberry shortcake. Now, I've eaten cakes before and I've eaten shortcakes before, but this is the first time that I ever had shortcake which was definitely not short of strawberries. To conserve on weight and space, we had done an old prospector trick of frying steaks and packing them down into tins covered with grease. Fresh steaks you keep that way for months and months, and you have your steak and shortening all in one can packed together. And when you reheat them, it isn't canned meat you have, it's real fresh steak. So we were getting all ready for a steak dinner with strawberry shortcake. Now don't worry, anyone, Ethel isn't going to miss out on that meal. She finally did find the fork she was looking for. It was way over the fire, but she did finally find it. Now, there's absolutely nothing like wild strawberry shortcake with real cream. And just in case that you don't believe that we had real cream way up there, here's the can it came in. We had cut every corner that we possibly could to hold down on excess weight on that trip. Our tent was a special small lightweight hiking tent. About the only weight we could have got along without was a camp stove, which you used for cooking in the tent on wet days and cold mornings, and these air mattresses. And about this time every day I was tempted to lighten the load by the extent of 2 air mattresses. Of course, before morning we would decide otherwise. There were 10 of those pack sacks to go into our little 7x7 tent every night. In case you're wondering where we found room to sleep, just remember what the bus driver says. There's always room at the back. There was just one with Ethel's things. There was the bedding. There was one with my things. There was one with the film. That was 9. There should be some more around. Oh, yes. There's the bag with the camera equipment. That's the last bag, and that's the last real number 1. Now, in case anyone has been wondering who was doing the filming while we were up there in the Headless Valley all alone, we had a slight assist from this alarm clock and a length of fish line. We would wind the clock up and set it a few minutes ahead, and then when the alarm went off, we knew we were on camera. Just across the river from where we had been camped at the strawberry patch, a glacier came right down to the bottom of the canyon, here on the shady side of the river where the sun only hit for a few minutes each day. Somehow I got into a snowball fight, but frankly I don't like snowball fights, so I retired as gracefully as I could, and we went back to the sunny side of the canyon where we had seen a lovely warm-looking pool. Ethel went down first and tested the water, and she claimed that it was too cold to swim in. Now, how could that water be cold here on the sunny side of the canyon? I went down and tested it and told her that it was just right for swimming. But I take that all back. This is strictly for the birds, penguins. While I warmed up in the sun, Ethel finally waded in, so I thought that I must have been mistaken. I tried it again. That was really a lovely looking pool, but believe me, it only looked that way. In case that anyone has any doubts that this water was cold, I thought I'd better bring back some proof. This was the sunny side of the canyon all right, but up in the trees we found another glacier running ice water down into that nice warm looking pool. But once I got my heart set on an ice warm dip, I wasn't going to let anything like a couple of glaciers interfere with things. That aluminum canoe was just as smooth inside as it was outside, and it would hold water in as good as it held it out. Of course, the running water could have been installed a little bit closer to the tub, but you can't have everything. In half an hour I came back and tested things, as it wasn't quite warm enough yet. When you have cold Saul on the job, you can afford to be fussy. This was about the middle of July, and old Sun was really doing a job. So when I came back in another half hour, it was just right temperature for a good relaxing bath. Boy, that's the life. Hot bath way up here in the Headless Valley with no one within about 100 miles. I even felt safe enough to do a little bit of singing in the bathtub. Singing in the bathtub, shouting for joy. But no matter where you are, there's always a killjoy. Have a heart. In some ways, the Headless Valley is a condensed travelogue of the entire world. Much of it is like the Grand Canyon. Parts of it resemble the Painted Canyon in California. Others are more like Bryce Canyon in Utah. It has falls like the Zambezi River in Africa. In places it has forests like the Amazon. Albert Bailey had compared it to his former home in northern Minnesota, and it is all these things in all those places, yet it is still the Hanny, the Headless Valley, which is like no place else on earth. Albert Bailey had gone back down the river, but once in a while we would come across one of his recent camps. We could always recognize them by the thickness of the mattress he made, and they were the only recent signs that anyone had ever passed this way before us. The rapids were progressively getting worse now. We held our breaths every time that solder-filled propeller hit bottom, but with our load of gasoline almost half gone now, the canoe was riding higher in the water, and it began to look as if we might even make it to the falls. Between the second and third canyons, the country opens out into another type of valley where the mountains are mainly bleak and bare, and very few trees hidden in the valley. Then shortly after entering the third canyon, you come to the narrowest point of the Hanny, which is well known as the Gate. Here the river makes a complete U-turn, almost doubling back on itself, and right at the bend of the U, the current churns through the narrowest gap in the cliffs of the entire river. On one side, the cliff drops sheer for thousands of feet, and across the river stands the pedestal known as Pulpit Rock. Between the two, a dark and sullen current was boiling and tossing debris up against the cliff below the Pulpit Rock. We didn't know what awaited us beyond this bend, so we lightened our load by leaving some empty gas containers behind, tied everything down thoroughly, and got ready to hit across the current at an angle. Everyone had warned us that we couldn't get up the Hanny with anything less than a 10-horsepower motor. Everyone except Mr. Faley, and he had just given us some good advice. Take things easy, he said. If you don't like the looks of a rapid, go ashore and look it over before you hit it. And in any case, if you have everything tied down, your load will probably float you out. We had just come through a rather bad rapid just below the Gate, which we had no desire to float back down into sideways in a swamp canoe. We figured the best strategy was to hit across fast into the slow water on the inside of the bend, get a little bit of speed, and then hit back to the outside again on the upper side of the bend. So we made it through with lots of power to spare and had passed one more landmark. The Nahanni Valley is about the most unpredictable weather that one would find any place. Sometimes one tiny cloud will begin to form right over the sun. Then in a few minutes that one little cloud will expand and spread over the entire sky. Suddenly, without warning, the rain will come down in buckets full. We got so that if we saw one of those clouds begin to expand, we would head for shore, tie up the canoe, and dive in under the canvas of the load. But it was all over just as quickly. In a matter of minutes, the clouds would evaporate and drift on, the sun would be shining down again. And apparently these sudden changes aren't just a matter of summer squalls either. We heard that the Nahanni country may go to 60 or 70 degrees below in the winter, yet in a matter of hours a chinook may blow in and lift the thermometer up to thawing, just a little change of about 100 degrees overnight. Well, from the flat-top direction mountain here, the last 15 miles of the river to the falls have the reputation of being the worst on the river. We lightened the load again, and even down to the last few pounds of sand that had tracked in. That's one thing about an aluminum canoe, they do wash just like a bathtub. From here on, you were shipping so many waves that it's a steady job of bailing to try and keep your load dry. You hit a roller, split it, like you got off lucky, and then the old rapid will take a quick heave and land the rest of the wave right in your lap. You lose all track of where you are. It's just head for the lowest waves and the motor roaring in your ear. And it was roaring something that sounded to me like "Go man go, go man go, go man go." About 5 miles above Direction Mountain, we heard a roaring which couldn't be anything else except Hell's Gate Rapid. And when the map makers pick one rapid out of a river like the Nahanni and name it Hell's Gate, it's time to go ashore and see why. Here at Hell's Gate, the river makes a right angle turn, but the rapid shoots straight across and splits on the cliff and forms two enormous whirlpools. We looked at the Hell's Gate from below. We climbed up on the cliff and we looked at it from above. We looked at it from close up. No matter how we looked at it, we didn't like its looks. So we decided that here was another place where discretion would be the better part of valor. There's a well-used, well-beaten portage trail which starts at the lower end of the rapid, and then it cuts through timber and up over the cliff and back down again to the upper whirlpool. The trail has about a quarter of a mile long, and by the way it looked packed down, it looked as a good many trappers and prospectors had used it over the years. We certainly gave the Simpson Sears Company credit for helping us select our canoe and motor. That aluminum canoe weighed only 70 pounds, but it had stood up to more beating in that 150 miles of river than most canoes would take in a lifetime of use. It had come through without a scratch, although I will say that before we got to the end of that portage, I would have sworn that it weighed more than 70 pounds. As we passed along the portage trail at the edge of the cliff, the Hell's Gate was slamming into the rocks about 200 feet below us, splitting both ways. The trail winds through thick timber to the whirlpool at the upper end of the rapid. We finally ended up by dragging the canoe down through the thick brush to the water at the upper end of the portage. Well, that's that. Now it's just a little thing of getting about 8 trips apiece to pack everything else around. Nothing to it after you get used to portaging. And believe me, after 9 trips, you're getting so used to portaging that you wish you'd gone through the rapid and drowned in the first place. It took us a little more than a half day to get everything around. So finally we had beaten the Hell's Gate. We took a moment to look at it from the upper side. But to be quite truthful, it didn't look any better from this side than it had from below. Again we set off, and now there were only 10 miles of the worst water in the river separating us from the falls. Along the upper part of the Nahanni is some of its loveliest scenery. It is so extremely inaccessible that very few people have ever seen this country. Here are whole mountains which look as if some giant hand had squeezed and twisted them out of all proportion. Everywhere the upheaval and the erosion have left a mixture of the weird and the beautiful. Some of the slopes are of a softer sandstone. Where that is the case, they often eroded into a series of weird hoodoos. You could almost imagine that a company of hooded monks was marching up some of these slopes. Again, we found more proof that the Headless Valley is far from being headless. We lay claim to being the only travelers who ever brought back some of those missing heads. We found in Nahanni a wonderful unspoiled vacation land with scenery which would make it a tourist mecca if it wasn't so inaccessible. Besides the unparalleled scenery, it has a summer climate of perpetual springtime. After the hot, muggy climate of the Liard, one has the feeling that since he entered the canyons, he passed into a world of complete perfection. I'm sure that if tourists knew that there was such a tremendous area lying there, with no broken bottles, no rusting tin cans, not a bit of scattered paper, they would certainly try to do something about it. The last few miles of the Nahanni below the falls are one solid rapid. There's nothing to do except head into the lowest waves and just hope for the best. As long as the motor keeps roaring in your ear, you'll probably get through. And that motor was really roaring. At full power, all those horsepower were sounding out a steady beat, and it sounded to me like bail man bail and go man go. As long as you bail, you can probably go. We had fought the river almost 165 miles. Now our supply of gas was almost gone. The canoe was riding high in the water, and we could slam through rapids. We couldn't have made it a full load at all. Finally, you reap your reward for all this uphill fight. The falls of South Nahanni are a truly tremendous spectacle. They're 316 feet high. Compared with Niagara's 150 feet, they reach almost twice as high. They rival the famous falls of the Zambezi in Africa, which are only 330 feet high. There was a period of the lowest water in the year, yet we'd been hearing the roaring and feeling the vibrations for several miles. In his book Dangerous River, R.M. Patterson claimed that in the spring of the year he had heard the roar of the falls from over 15 miles downriver. The falls of the South Nahanni are one of the most exquisitely beautiful sights it has ever been our privilege to view. Yet only a handful of people have ever stood here and looked at them. So very few people have seen the falls that we were quite surprised that we were standing there gazing at it to turn around and see another tourist. Just standing around admiring the view was one lone soul who had managed to find his way clear up there into the Northwest Territories. We came to the conclusion that he was probably come to see the falls and had lost his way in all those canyons. We had about 3 weeks before we were due back in South Nahanni. We had left word that we would be back by a certain date, so we decided to take a couple of weeks' supplies and go look the country over above the falls. We left all our other supplies well cached and set off up the old Portage Trail with just a couple of light backpacks. The first part of the Portage Trail goes up pretty steep, and as we topped the ridge and looked down the valley, we knew in that direction the closest settlement was South Nahanni, 165 miles away. Then swinging away to the north trail, we climbed up to get a closer look at the falls. We knew that in this direction the next habitation would probably be a Klavik up on the Arctic Ocean, about 600 miles. One can swing a bit to the right and hit toward Wrigley in about a couple of 100 miles. It looked as it wasn't a crowded country up there at all. The water roaring over the falls makes such a noise that we could hardly hear ourselves heard by shouting. And then above the brink there is a rapid split off into roaring chutes by huge fingers of rock. To get a canoe into navigable water above the falls takes about a mile of portage to get around all this. We had heard of a lovely country lying above the falls, unmapped and practically unexplored. We didn't want to do all that portaging, so our intention was to hike on above the falls a ways and then strike off away from the river and see what some of that country was like. After following the valley for some considerable distance above the falls, we struck out into dense timber. We were heading on a compass course toward a certain odd-shaped mountain range which we had seen far in the northwest. Early August is the nicest time in the north. We hadn't seen a mosquito since leaving the hot springs. These were wonderful lazy fall days, and the nights were warm. There was a tang of spruce and pine in the air, and just a tiny haze of smoke from some far distant forest fire. And then again I dropped down across valleys choked with underbrush and deadfalls. We weren't going any place in particular, and we weren't in any hurry, so we traveled as much or as little as we liked each day. Each day we made camp just where the afternoon found us. We carried no tent. Whenever we decided to camp, it only took a few minutes to throw together a prospector's brush shelter. I would trim all the lower branches off some tree and nick it a few times and bend it over to form a lean-to shelter. Then when I finished trimming out all the underneath branches and thatching the whole thing, we always found it quite snug and warm for the night. We were traveling as light as possible. I just had a belt axe and a compass and a coil of light nylon rope, our 2 weeks' supplies. Ethel just had a pack sack with a couple of air mattresses and a couple of blankets. We preferred the air mattresses to a spruce bough bed because we could camp any place comfortably, even on a rock pile. And if it did turn cold, we could make a bough bed and use the mattresses for top blankets. For supplies, we just had the old prospector standbys of flapjack mix, rice and raisins, rolled oats, and so forth. One evening after supper, we heard the squirrels way over across the valley setting up a chatter. Each squirrel would raise a racket and then go silent, and then another would, a little closer, would begin to scold. Something was coming our way and across the valley, so we sat down beside our brush shelter with our camera ready and just waited. Pretty soon a big black wolf trotted out of the brush. He didn't understand the whir of our camera, but he wasn't really afraid of it. That wolf had probably never run across humans before. He went on about his business, and we went on about ours. Ever since leaving the river, we hadn't seen an axe cut or any other sign that anyone had ever been this way before. In places, the brush was so thick that it was almost like a jungle. And where the trees shaded the ground, the moss would be almost like walking on a mattress. There were dozens and dozens of fast little mountain streams to cross. If at all possible, we tried to keep from wading them. We could still remember the temperature of that swimming pool. Well, one day followed another, and we still hadn't reached the range of mountains we had been heading for. Over a third of our supplies were gone now, and still the lure of the unknown kept calling us on up over the next hill. Finally, we climbed up along a ridge, and from the top the country lay all spread out before us. Ethel got out a map and sat down to try and figure out where we were. And as near as we could tell, we were somewhere in that area above the falls, which is marked on the map as mountainous country on map. It was time that we turned back. The mountain range which we had been heading towards was so close that we decided to go on for just 2 more days. And right there we realized why some of those 26 missing persons had never returned. The lure of the unknown had drawn them on just 1 more day, then another, and then another, until their supplies ran out, and it was too late to turn back. Several of the 26 had been trappers who had been murdered for the furs. 2 of the victims were found with twisted guns beside them. They were probably killed by grizzly bears. One starved to death when his partner didn't meet him at the agreed time with his winter supplies. But most of those who disappeared were seasoned prospectors who had walked into the brush with only a few supplies and expected to live off the country. And it isn't an easy country to live off, for sometimes one goes for days without seeing a living thing. Well, we carried no guns, so we had even less chance to live off the country if we overstayed our leave. But we were almost to that odd-shaped mountain which we had been heading towards, and as soon as we reached it, we intended to turn back. With innumerable of those fast streams to cross, we tried to avoid getting into them if possible, for there is no better way to get blistered feet than hiking with wet socks. Sometimes we would find ready-made crossings on logs. They work fine if you don't fall off that log. A lot of them are small creeks which you manage to jump. Others which were a little too wide to jump, I would hunt up a rock and toss it in for a stepping stone. Oh, I'm afraid that creek is going to take another stone. I always claim that just a few minutes extra work like this pays off in the long run by keeping your shoes and socks dry on the trail. There's nothing worse than tramping around all day in wet shoes and socks. And there's no sense doing it when with just a few minutes extra work you can toss in a couple of stepping stones and walk right across to the other side, high and dry. Now, I knew Ethel would back me up when I tell you about those stepping stones being great for keeping your feet out of the ice-cold water. We crossed dozens of those streams, and she didn't get her feet wet once. When at last we reached the base of that odd-shaped mountain that we had been heading for, the last stream which we had been following seemed to disappear right into the cliff. At first we thought that there must be a spring flowing out from under the cliff, but as we came closer we could see that the stream was flowing out of a narrow cleft in the cliff which was practically invisible except from one angle. There was a very faint trail heading into that defile, a trail which didn't look as if it had been used for years and years. We couldn't have gone home happy without knowing where that trail led, so we followed on in, just hoping that we wouldn't meet some grizzly bear coming down. In this narrow gap between the cliffs with that ice-cold stream running, there was a damp chill in the air, no sound except rolling water. It really had been a great place to get close up to grizzlies, but I can assure you that was one time I just wasn't interested in game pictures. Ethel got in a hurry to catch up there. Sometimes there would be steep rock shoulders to climb over, and the trail kept leading on and up. It looked like we were getting a long ways back into the mountain, but it probably wasn't as far as it seemed, for a lot of the going was pretty steep. The trail kept rising all the time and seemed to be bearing a little more and more to the left. After an hour or so steady climbing, the cliffs above us got lower, and we could look out through a gap down into a mountain ring valley where half a dozen little spring-fed creeks joined together and formed another small river which was going out through another gap in the cliffs. Well, we were satisfied that this little hidden valley was going to be the end of our trip, and as the main stream seemed to be heading in the direction of Nahanni, we decided to follow it as long as it continued in the right direction. I was just getting myself a drink in one of the smaller creeks before leaving when I spotted something glittering in the water and called Ethel over to see it. It was a little odd-shaped lump of yellowish metal, and it seemed to be rather heavy for its size. Now, at that time, I had never seen any gold, but this looked suspiciously like what I had always imagined gold should look like. When Ethel came over to examine it, she spotted something else in the water. We found that glittering there in the stream were several more of those same kind of nuggets. Whatever they were we were certain that they were a mineral of some kind. Here's a large nugget that I picked up first. It was quite sure that I had never seen anything quite like it before. So we got out our frying pan and tried panning in that patch of gravel, just rolling the pan around and picking out the largest rocks. Whatever they were, those nuggets seemed to be in quantity. When I finished washing out the sand and dirt and picking out the gravel, every pan had a layer of that gold or fool's gold or whatever it was, and it all appeared to be extremely heavy. At that time I had never seen either gold or fool's gold, but I remembered reading somewhere that fool's gold was hard and brittle and couldn't be shaved or flattened, while real gold should be quite soft and workable. Well, whatever it was, the nuggets turned out to be fairly so. When I tested one, I found that I could whittle off fragments with just a pocket knife. And when I laid one of the little round nuggets on a rock and pounded it with the back of the belt axe, it spread and flattened until it turned out almost real like a coin. Well, along with the weight, to me it added up to pretty good indications of gold. In fact, I was convinced enough that I set to work panning all that I thought I could carry out of there. We debated on whether to show these sequences or not, but we felt that you would enjoy seeing them and that it wouldn't be fair not to show our entire trip. However, just one word of warning, when I finally decided to show these scenes, I camouflaged the location of this little hidden valley so that I'm quite sure that nobody is going to locate it from my directions. I have often heard the old joke, something about keeping your savings in your sock. Well, I don't as a rule subscribe to that practice, but this wasn't a matter of choice. My socks were the only containers I had along. In fact, those were the only socks I had along. So some of the nuggets were considerable size. They were all terrifically heavy. I began to think that this was going to be a mighty long pack back to the falls, and the joke would really be on me if it turned out that this was only fool's gold. However, I couldn't resist filling my containers right up to the top. Next morning we got ready to leave what we were now calling our own hidden valley. We gathered up what food supplies we had left, along with the mineral samples. It made it a lot heavier to pack than I had started out with. Following the main stream out of the valley, we were almost through a gap in the range when the cliff on our side of the little stream barred our way. It looked as if we would be almost past the cliffs if we could just get across to the other side. That current was very swift and looked deep in the middle, so I tied on the line and Ethel held it while I went ahead to test the crossing. As soon as it gets knee-deep, that current begins to lift you off your feet. I was just starting into the main channel when a rolling rock hit me on the ankle and knocked me off my feet. Well, when I was lucky that Ethel had a good hold on the line, but when I managed to catch my feet again, the pack sack with our food and mineral supplies disappeared. There was a rock rapid below, and after we had gone back a ways and climbed around the cliff, I poked into every crevice that I thought that the pack could have lodged in, but we never did see it again. And now time was really running out on us. With all our supplies gone, and at least a week's hike ahead, it looked as if we'd be a couple of mighty hungry hikers before we could manage to walk out. Well, the only way to get any place fast in the north is by water, and as we were wishing for our canoe, I got an idea that maybe I could manufacture a substitute that might get us out of there a little bit faster than paddling through the brush. This was just an experiment. I didn't know whether it would work or not, and if it didn't work, it would only lose us about 20 minutes of hiking time. But if it did work, it might save us days of pushing through the brush. So first I cut a few poles and trimmed all the branches off them. Then I laid out 2 of the long poles and tied the rest on into shorter lengths, tied on crossways. I blew up the air mattresses, laid them on the top, and lashed the whole contraption together as well as I could with that 300 feet of nylon rope. This wasn't going to have much eye appeal, but then you can't expect everything. All we were hoping for was something that just might get us out of there a bit faster than walking, and it began to look as if this might do the trick. Our last pack sack with just a couple of blankets in it was now lashed down in the middle, and as soon as I pushed the raft off, it rode so high in the water that we began to get the feeling that it might carry us out. This didn't look like much of a canoe, and I had an idea it wasn't going to control much like one, but I cut a couple of poles which I hoped we could control it with. Ethel got set in front, and I got ready to push off. I had an idea that whenever I jumped aboard, about all we would be able to do was give the odd push on the bottom and hope for the best. When in over 3,000 miles of previous river travel, we have shot lots of rapids by canoe, but we never got on anything before that had the delusions of being a merry-go-round. That raft shot out into the main current, but no matter what we did, it absolutely refused to go straight. We'd push on one side and we'd push on the other, but it still went right around in circles. And when we tried to get ashore that night, it refused to stop. I had to pick out a shallow spot and get soaked before we finally did get to shore. When we finally got stopped that evening, we estimated that we had covered about as much country as we could have hiked through in 3 days. And who should come stalking around but one of those silly fool hens. We hadn't worried too much about starving these days because the bushes were covered with rose hips, which are rather good emergency food. But when one contemplates a diet of rose hips, which taste about like overripe crab apples, anything as edible as a fool hen shouldn't come strutting around. I am afraid that I must admit that we finally had roast fool hen that night. Next morning we climbed on the raft again, and by now we were getting so used to it that we didn't even try to keep it head straight. Whether it was going straight ahead or sideways didn't seem to make much difference. Finally, in the evening, we began to see the hills on the other side of the Headless Valley show up ahead. In just a couple of days, on traveling on that fast stream, we had covered a distance which would have taken us at least a week of hiking. We hit the Nahanni only a few miles above the point where we had struck out into the brush, and it was certainly a great feeling to arrive back at the Portage Trail It was almost like a homecoming to find the falls still pouring over the rink. Then to go down the trail and find all our other supplies still safely cached. Next morning, I was up before Ethel was awake. There was a chill of fall in the air, and the mists and the honey were hanging lower on the hills. It really felt wonderful to go back and be back in camp again. After a 2-day diet of rose hips and cool hen, now we had all the supplies and the time in the world, plus a downriver run. So I decided to get a fire going and then set out and have a leisurely shave while the fire was coming up to the right heat for flapjacks. Of course, camp cooking is an exact science, and your fire has to be brought up to just the exact temperature, not too hot and not too cold. But I had made up my mind to have a leisurely shave, and that's what I was going to do in spite of anything. Just because you're cooking on a campfire isn't any excuse for getting excited, probably cutting your throat in the bargain. Well, when you do finally get your fire up, just to that exact heat, then your pan has to be thoroughly greased. Next, you take an exact quantity of flour and add carefully measured quantities of your other ingredients. Now, just a second there. That fire's getting too hot. Now, where was I? Oh, yes. You had your other ingredients carefully measured. Whip to a batter and pour out just the right amount into the pan. And we have one flapjack coming up. And while that one is baking, we'll take a carefully measured amount of sugar, add the right amount of water, we'll have some maple syrup. Now with an expert flip of the wrist, one flapjack. Don't worry, I'll eat that one myself. And if I can find a moment to add the right amount of maple, we'll be all set. Hey, hey, morning in the muskeg, sunrise in the swamps. Hey, hey, come and get it before I throw them out. Well, well, I finally got one on my own side. Our friend the gull was still around, but it looked like he was getting about ready to leave. And if he was lost, he better get a move on, because we were also getting ready to go out. It's one thing fighting your way up all through all those rapids, but it's quite something else tearing through them on the way downstream. Fighting upstream, you barely move against the current, and you have lots of time to pick the easiest route through the rapids. But on the way down, you just have to keep the motor at almost full power to hold control of the canoe, and the motor speed added to the speed of the current, and means that you're really traveling. There's just a moment to hit a rapid, pick the best spot through it, and then you're long gone. But in one way, the rapids aren't nearly as dangerous coming down. If you do break a sheer pin, there isn't the danger of getting carried down, back downstream, backwards, the danger of getting sideways the wave and rolling over, as you are when you're fighting upstream. During going down, you just bounce over everything, and we were really bouncing. In the worst of the rapids, we would ship tremendous quantities of water. It was a good thing that the other stretches weren't as rough and I could catch up on bailing again. I began to envy our friend the gull. He was bouncing right along with us, and he wasn't shipping a drop of water. On some of the rapids, the only smooth water was right in against the cliff. Once you get into those channels, it's hard to decide whether to stay away from the rapid or keep away from that cliff. Probably it's harder to just sit up there in front with the water of the cliff rushing at you and not be able to do much of anything about it. I will say, though, that in over 1,000 miles of rivers that summer, Ethel was never a backseat driver. She always sat in front. Of course, from up there, she could spot rocks easier than I could from the back. And if she pointed, it usually meant that there's a rock dead ahead, and I had better move over, even if it meant getting into worse water. Before we started up the Nahanni, we had traveled many of the rivers of Western Canada, but the Nahanni was the worst water we had ever seen. Our friend the gull kept bouncing right along with us. I don't know who was guiding who out of there. We shot through everything on the way down. The Hell's Gate Rapid and George's Riffle that we worked so hard getting around on the way up went by so fast that we were in and out of them almost before we knew it. These rapids you have seen us coming through aren't the worst ones. In those really bad rapids, we had more than enough to do just trying to keep afloat without attempting to use a camera. There were a couple of places in the Nanny where float planes can be landed. One is in Dead Man's Valley, and the other is above the falls. There are also a number of other places where a helicopter can land on beaches if the water doesn't happen to be too high. But to really see the Headless Valley requires a fight by boat for 165 miles up through these canyons and rapids, and then another fight to get back down out again. Quite a few of those nearly 30 missing persons have probably drowned in the same fast water. And it is one of the reasons this valley has so long remained such a land of myth and mystery. We were riding a current which much of the time traveled at over 10 miles an hour, so along with our motor speed all of these days, which we had fought upstream between South Nahanni and the falls, went through in a short 2-day run. But right now our supply of gasoline was running out on us. The last gallon was in the motor, and I was expecting it to run out any moment. We camped that night in the upper end of Dead Man's Valley, in the woods where the McLeods were killed. With the rapids pushing along, it doesn't take long to get back down out of the canyon. Next morning we shot through George's Riffle and the first canyon, but then our gas ran out right at the head of the splits, so it was paddled from there on down. With the lower water of late summer, the river wasn't roaring like it had been when we came up, but even with just paddles, we made pretty fair time as long as we had the fast current of the splits. Then finally the Nahanni Butte loomed up and we got into the loops and turns of the last 8 miles of dead water. Now there was absolutely no current at all. We had to just dig for every foot we gained. At last the Nahanni Butte loomed up and we paddled into South Nahanni. There the mosquitoes were still all gone, and in this quiet current the river had warmed up. The 2 youngest Turner children were making the most of the swimming. It wouldn't last long, for up in that high country we had already felt the chill fall in the air. Ralph and Martha would soon be back at their lessons again. They do their studying at home by correspondence courses, and I would say that they were probably farther advanced than most children their same ages attending the public school system. But right now school was a long ways off, and they was a lot more interested in the water fight. In South Nahanni, the elevation is only 800 feet above sea level, and those long summer days of almost continual sunshine do wonders for the gardens and flower beds. It was just about the last of August now, and Mrs. Turner's flower beds were at the peak of their perfection. All the geologists were gone, and with them all the boat and helicopter traffic which had been around on our way up, but there was an almost continual traffic of bees trying to collect the last drop of nectar before fall closed in. And there on the edge of the Arctic, in the shades of Nahanni Butte, we saw about as nice a vegetable garden as we had ever seen any place. Now we still had over 300 miles of empty rivers lying between us and Old Fort Nelson, and all of it was upstream. So with full gas containers, we set off up the Liard, and Nahanni Butte began dropping behind. We fought ourselves back up all those rivers to civilization, but in some future day we intend to go back up those canyons through the Toga Show to the Headless Valley in the mountains fold, where the grunt of a bear can make your blood run cold, to the Valley of Fear, where the trees close in, damp as a grave and blacker than sin, then up over passes and out of the dark, till last we drop down to a woodland park, where a trail leads in, faint and old, and lures us on to the call of gold. And although gold turns to fool's gold, as this probably will, we know of a treasure which will be there still. As our canoe dances on down some mountain stream, we are sure of a treasure in peace and contentment supreme. I hope you have all enjoyed traveling with us into the Headless Valley. Good night, all.